The iPad first generation was a very interesting product back in the day, releasing in the April of 2010, 12 years and 9 months ago at the time of writing this. It had Apple's first proper Apple Silicon chip, the A4. Its purpose was as an in-between device of a phone and a laptop, and it did this relatively well, having mobile versions of the desktop work apps like Keynote. They're a bit weaker, but in a lot of cases, got the job done for a decently cheaper price than a laptop. So how does it hold up nearly 13 years later? Looking here, I have both US and Australian prices of the cheapest MacBook for the time and the iPad 1. There are of course differences, like the cheapest iPad having 16 gigs of flash storage, while the cheapest MacBook has a 250GB hard drive. The MacBook having more uses than the iPad, and the Mac Mini being significantly cheaper than this MacBook. But the Mac Mini isn't an exactly on-the-go machine, while both of these devices are. Two major upsides of the iPad is that it has the ability to use iPhone apps and have a SIM card put in to connect to 3G networks, which is useful and makes sense for working on the go, like in the car, or on a long trip, or a cafe where the Wi-Fi just isn't up to the task required, or you want to go through more secure channels than public Wi-Fi. There is a big price jump for a reason. The iPad would not have been able to run the correct software for most workplaces, but for the workplace basics, like taking notes in meetings, looking up slideshows, and consuming content for web browsing, the iPad would be a pretty good job, and for a long time. In battery tests done, it states both devices have an average battery life of 10 hours, which is really good for back in the day, especially for a mobile device like the iPad. And this iPad, it has a rather interesting design. It has curved back, like the iPad 2, 3 and 4 that came afterwards, but flat edges, like the modern iPads. Despite its maybe slightly odd feel, I find it comfortable to hold and use. On the bottom of the device, you can see the iconic 30-pin connector and speaker grills. It is the only iPad to not have any kind of camera system, no back or front camera, which should come the next year with the significantly upgraded iPad 2. It still has the Photos app due to being able to sync photos over iCloud. This was leaned into with the first few iPads. As you can see here, there is a button on the lock screen that allows you to cycle through your photos, turning your iPad into an animated picture frame of sorts, which hey, is some sort of useful feature, should you still have this iPad somewhere lying around. I find it pretty cool, and something that would be nice to have easy access to on newer iPads. Turning to the side of the device, there are the volume buttons, lock button, and another switch that you don't see on newer iPads, which was originally going to be the mute switch, but changed to the lock switch for screen rotation, and of course, there's also a headphone jack. This iPad, despite bringing so much to the table, is actually one of the worst iPads, especially in terms of software support. It released in April 2010 with iPhone OS 3. Yep, up until iOS 4, it was actually called iPhone OS, which is kind of funny. It was given iOS 4 2 months later in June 2010, then some minor updates until iOS 5 in the October of 2011. Then some more minor updates until September 2012 with iOS 6, right? Nope, that's where the iPad first generation lost major software support. Not being able to update to iOS 6 means its software support lasted from April 2010 to September 2012. That's right, 2 years and 4 months of major software support. Whereas the iPad 2 got from iOS 4 to iOS 9, which is 5.5 years of major software support, an extra 3 years for a product which was only 11 months newer. It was ended for a reason. There was a good chance that despite iOS 6 not drastically changing the experience like iOS 7 did, there is a good chance the first generation iPad would have felt much slower on this version. But wait, you might be saying, doesn't it have the same chip from the iPod Touch 4, which runs iOS 6 quite well? Alright, so you probably wouldn't say that. There are a few reasons for why this is the case. The big one being the iPad has a much larger screen, more pixels to push, more power is required to do so, and having the same power as these smaller devices means it couldn't keep up nearly as well. But then there's also the case of the iPhone 4, which got to iOS 7, which slowed it down. Not awfully, however, it had double the RAM of both of these devices, which looking through a modern day lens plays a big part in the longevity of these devices. And how's that experience on iOS 5? Well, it's decently quick, not super fast, but completely acceptable for a device of this age, on its latest version. Opening apps quickly and reliably. Something that can't be said for the iPad 2 and 3. The apps it can open, however, well, there aren't an awful lot of them that support iOS 5 or even have the latest compatible version for it. These few you see here are the only ones that I could find in my own apps that would download onto this device. Even some of them downloaded, but won't open. A little while ago, this iPad could have been used as a decent Netflix machine, but Netflix recently dropped support for these older devices. It's annoying, but it's reasonable that they would for iOS 5 and 6. They are now more than a decade old, so what can it be used for? Well, if you have a large collection of old mobile games on your account, the iPad 1 should be able to run them without much difficulty. The same also goes for anybody with a large collection of media saved on iTunes, as the iPad 1st Gen can still sync it over from the cloud or a computer with iTunes on it, meaning it can be a music player or media device for anything that is saved onto it. There is some more hope for the iPad 1, however. There is another thing that hasn't been mentioned yet: jailbreaking. Something which is fairly easy to do on older devices like these ones. I'll post a video soon on jailbreaking this one I have here, but in the meantime, let's go over exactly what that will accomplish with this iPad. For one, it will allow you to download more apps that have the latest compatible version, more customizability inside apps and on the home screen, fun animations, helpful tools, and many more things. There's so much jailbreaking can do, and I can't explain it all here. But trust me, it can help bring so much life back into almost any old device. I'll go over it a bit more in the upcoming video. Back in the day, the iPad had quite a mixed reception, with some critics calling it an oversized iPod Touch, and it was seen by a group of people to not offer enough to choose it over a cheap laptop. This worried Steve Jobs, the CEO of the time, but on the day of release, 300,000 units were sold in the first day, and customers loved the device. It became an instant hit and paved the way to the computers we see today. Steve Jobs said he wanted to create a computer-like device that you could carry around like a book and learn to use in 20 minutes, with features like an instant on display. They definitely succeeded with it, and built on it more and more as each later model was released, and now are bringing this over to their Macs, with the Apple Silicon transition, which brings across features like Instant On. So at the end of the day, the iPad 1 was a great, first of its kind product, which always has its fair share of issues, and paved the way for what we see today: iPads crossing over into the professional and consumer markets, and dominating the tablet marketplace altogether. So that's about it from me this time, and I'll see you guys next time. See ya!